the essence of Plato's cave. In teaching us a new visual code, photographs alter and enlarge our notions of what is worth looking at and what we have the right to observe. They are a grammar, and even more importantly, an ethics of seeing. In other words, photographs and documentary are an essential way to shape our perception of both the ethics of seeing and of the past itself. It focuses around what we have the right to observe. In Sontag's words, they are a grammar and, even more importantly, an ethics of seeing. Finally, the most grandiose result of the photographic enterprise is to give us the sense that we can hold the whole world in our heads as an anthology of images. However, to the right mind, an anthology can turn into a collection, and a collection thus turns to obsession. An ethics of seeing that is skewed backwards, a sense of the whole world which is actually very narrow in truth. The most dangerous element, perhaps, of any photograph is that it passes for incontrovertible proof that a given thing happened. The picture may distort, but there is always a presumption that something exists, or did exist, in the manner of what's described in the picture. All such talismanic uses of photographs express a feeling both sentimental and implicitly magical. They are attempts to contact or lay claim to another reality. As such, the more time passes, the more distortion a photograph evokes. And thus, the more time passes, the more magical or far-fetched the other reality being laid claim to can feel. Thus, the art of photography and the practice of tattooing, particularly the Japanese practice of irezumi tattoos, can be seen as holding many similarities in that they both attempt to lay claim to another reality. Within irezumi, the tattooist attempts to link the fate of the tattoo with the person that they are tattooing, while in photography, the link is self-sufficient. The person who takes the photograph and then looks back on it is retroactively interacting with themselves and constructing a new narrative based on the memory of the photograph rather than the actual event in the photograph. Perhaps in the best description of this narrow focus described in relation to photography, Sontag writes, "Time eventually positions most photographs, even the most amateurish, at the level of art." Rosler supports this in her statement that documentary is a little like horror movies, putting a face on fear and transforming threat into fantasy, into imagery. One can handle imagery by leaving it behind. Thus, a documentary of the self, at least in regards to addiction, can such be summed in the metaphor of a horror movie. One puts their own face on their fear and transforms the threat of continued usage into fantasy, into romanticism, into imagery, into an aesthetic, whether that be one of the pothead, the meth head, and so on. It is a sense of building community in order to reinforce the boundaries we build around ourselves, especially in regards to substance abuse. Thus, the world of an addict is hard to leave, beautiful and enticing, yet incredibly superficial. Larry Clark's photos of Tulsa speed freaks probably sum it up the best. A beautiful, secret world, much of it sordid, and although there is plenty of sex, death, violence, anxiety, boredom, there is no polemic apparent, so it doesn't really matter whether or not we can trust these photos as documents. To see them as photographs, no more and no less, is enough, remarks Owen Edwards. These transitions from anxiety to violence to boredom, with little rhyme or reason to their occurrence, sums a good example of addiction in full force. However, the reason addicts persist in such a difficult world is because they see a beautiful, secret place that offers boundless escapism and in the short term reduces disassociation. However, in the long term, it greatly increases it and leads to a sense of reliance. The act of addiction, particularly in regards to drugs, becomes an ends to a means, an ends to feel, to be in world, to be more like Heidegger's Dasein than Levi-Strauss's structuralist nature. The ultimate affect of addiction is death. But is the usage of such drugs, of such substances to distract from death, or simply to pass the time? As Barthes remarks, ultimately what I am seeking in the photograph taken of me is death. Death is the ethos of that photograph. Indeed, I believe documentation and substance addiction have much in common in regards to an unraveling of the soul. Engagement in both practices suggests that one is confused or anxious about their state of being, and needs to find a way to somehow collate it into an understandable binary category. As Lowry writes, the state of our soul is one thing. The account we give of it, to ourselves and others, is another. Our soul is a moving tableau which we depict unceasing. We spend much time trying to render it faithfully, but it exists as a whole and all at once. The mind does not proceed one step at a time, as does expression. In the same manner that a photograph cannot be de-developed after it is rendered in the darkroom, the same process applies with addiction. Recovery is never linear, relapse is often, and an entirely different tableau of understanding must be formed on how to progress along such an irregular path in order to achieve some form of recovery.